And I'm actually going to focus on the biology behind this really intricate interaction that exists between molds and plants, the soil, the environment, and at the end, the animals and the consumers on that production chain. And I think that's really important because we spend a lot of effort trying to, compartmentalize this mycotoxin issue. We want to talk about how many mycotoxins we should analyze, what's actually a safe level, what we should be looking for, what tests we analyze. And I think, if you look at it at a broader perspective, you can get a better idea of why we should just include it into our normal management protocols on food safety, animal health, and then just try to incorporate that into our actual system. And it makes a lot more sense because it's very interrelated with everything else that occurs at the farm level. One of the things I wanted to mention to you guys, there's a lot of stuff that we think we know, and then we think we're understanding about molds and mycotoxins, and all of a sudden the next day you wake up and it's completely thrown upside down. I think one of the most peculiar things that I've read over the years is that you probably all remember the great nuclear plant accident in Kiev in the Ukraine. And one of the things that happened there is a group of researchers sent these robots into the aftermath of that accident. And one of the things that they found was almost everything was dead, but they found colonies of these microorganisms. And one of the most persistent microorganisms they found in there were molds. They actually found this Aspergillus mold that was actually very close to where the highest radiation concentrations were. And they found that these molds were actually adapting by producing more melanin and getting darker pigmentation. And they were actually able to convert the gamma rays as a source of energy. So these molds adapted fairly quickly to that environment and were able to thrive there. And more recently, they've actually taken that same strain and they took it to the space station and had it there for I don't know how long periods of times. And they're actually using that actual mold to understand adaptations to different types of environments. So I think what I typically like to tell people is that molds don't read the same books that you and I read, right? Anytime you think you understand why this should occur, you should really focus on the biology behind this because they're very adaptive. They're very good at changing the scenario into their favor because what they're actually doing is trying to compete in this ecosystem for nutrients, for substrate, for viability. So I'm going to focus a lot of the presentation on that. I already blew probably the first 5 minutes, and this is not running, just in case. Am I supposed to hit it?
No, keep going.
I'll trust that you guys will let me know. So I'm going to focus on this very basic question: why have mycotoxin concerns increased? Again, a lot of times I hear this in the field. My grandfather was a farmer. He never mentioned the word mycotoxins. Why are we so concerned about that? Obviously, there's a commercial component of that, right? There is a commercial side of this industry that allows us to get more information, a lot more information on that. But I will make the argument that there is a higher increase in the effects and the incidence of mycotoxin contamination. And I'll try to show you a couple of examples. But one of the main things that I want to focus on is there's a better analytical procedure, right? 50 years ago, we were able to analyze one mycotoxin, and it took forever to get it done. Now companies offer 50, 200 mycotoxin analysis. I'm not exactly sure what 300 or 295 of those toxins actually do, but I mean, we can get that information. We can analyze at the parts per trillion levels. We're very well equipped to analyze for these mycotoxins, okay? And that gives us a plethora of information. I usually joke around with my colleagues that the best way not to have mycotoxins is to not analyze for it, right? The more you analyze, the more sensitive your method is, the more you're going to find them because they're ubiquitous in this environment. So when we look at the analytical procedures, we have everything. We have this really rapid monitoring, qualitative type of assays that will tell you yes or no after a certain threshold. Those are really useful at the feed mill level. They're useful for receiving and rejecting materials at the mill. We have semi-quantitative level assays. TLC is still the #1 method for mycotoxin analysis worldwide. It's a very low cost of startup in this type of analysis, and it does a tremendous job. We have ELISA test kits, other type of test kits that can be quantitative also. Then we have the other extreme end here. It's gold standard for many years has been Hplc analysis. Now we have this liquid chromatography with tandem mass spec, $400,000 piece of equipment, PhD chemists running it behind it. I would make the argument that the method is actually not that important, right? Because we have a really basic problem when we think about analytical procedures and the information we get back from the analytical procedures. In a general analytical procedure, the first step of analytical procedure is the conversion of a large lot of material into a very small quantity of material that was going to go to the lab. Typically, we think the first step in the lab is receiving the sample. No, it's what you send to that sample that has a great bearing on the quality of that sample. And when what you're analyzing on that feed stuff is not homogeneously distributed, that first step in the analytical procedure is extremely critical. And whether you're using $1 million piece of equipment or a $10 test kit, if the sample you submitted to the lab is not accurate and representative, it's unimportant at that pace, okay? So we look at some of the data of Dr. Whitaker, USDA office in Raleigh, North Carolina. We had a pleasure of working with him in many different projects over the years. And one of the things that he's actually gone out there and looked at aflatoxin variants in samples. And this is actual real data calculated. And he says in his assays that 75.5% of the error associated with an aflatoxin analysis is in the collection of the sample. Think about that for 1 second. 16% of the error is on the collection of the subsample of that sample. So you send a pound to the lab's going to use 3 grams of that, okay? He's going to add another 16% to that error analysis. Only 8.6% of the error is on the analytical procedure itself, okay? So whether this is $1 million machine or a $3 kit, the reality is if you don't correct for the error before you submit that sample, it's really not that greatly important. And I guess we get in these conversations all the time, well, he did an ELISA or he did an Hplc, and there's better methods. There's no argument that there is better method. But if we don't solve the sample collection and the quality of that sample submitted to the lab, we're really behind the ball, okay? I rarely use the value that I get from an analytical procedure as a tool for making decisions. It just tells me there was conditions on that feed for mold growth and toxin production. That's it. The number doesn't really mean that much to me because I am not entirely confident that we can solve many of these problems in a traditional farm or feed mill environment. Here's a really quick example of what we can do in a practical sense. This is actually basically looking at 5-fold increase in sample collection, okay? So if I'm traditionally sending a 1 kg sample, and I increase that size of that sample to 4.5, okay? A 5-fold increase approximately of that sample, meaning basically that I took 5 times more samples, not just the bigger samples here, I took more sample points. I'm able to reduce the variance of that about 80%. Okay, pretty basic, okay? Anybody can go in there and say, if you take 5 samples, take 10. If you take 2 samples, increase the amount of samples that you're collecting and that would be really important. The total variance is reduced about 60%. So we really need to think about what we're actually submitting to the lab, all right? We really need to put enough emphasis. If we're gonna spend $60 on a mycotoxin analysis and we only spend 3 minutes in collection of that sample, then we're really not getting at the information that we really should be focusing on that. And I think that's a really big problem, and that's something that even the top groups that are actually looking at the analytical capabilities are not addressing enough to my preference. I see people collect samples all the time. I'm a little concerned about the quality of that sample, and I think it's an area we can improve significantly going forward. It gets harder when you're talking about forage samples. It gets harder when you're talking about TMRs and complete mixed rations and other formats, but we need to focus a little bit more on our analytical procedure. I'm going to give you a really basic sample. Try not to dwell too much on this. This is from a USDA research study done by Dr. Whitaker. A lot of corn. Each one of those samples, sample collected, analyzed for protein. We would say that protein is somewhat homogeneous, distributed in that feed stuff. If you take 2 samples in this, let's say you take this sample and that sample, average of those 2 samples is 13%. You're really close to what the mean of that. So that says that I only need about 2 to 3 samples on a lot of grain to get a good assessment of protein, right? If we take those same 2 samples, this one and that one, for aflatoxin analysis, we get 0. If by luck we take that sample and that sample, we get 100 parts per billion. So we can either accept the material as 0 or we can reject the material with 100 parts per billion. Either way, we're wrong. We're very wrong on that. The total mean concentration is only 10 parts per billion. Okay, so if we use the 20 parts per billion for transport across borders, then we would reject this in some cases. Otherwise, in some of the data, 2 to 3 kernels of grain is enough to contaminate the whole lot, and that's where you get that concentration because that mold will grow in those environments where those conditions are favorable for that growth. The other side of the analytical procedure that I have a lot of issues with is our own visual biases that we introduce into the procedure. Almost every time I ask somebody to collect a sample, I ask them, I try to assess if they want to find mycotoxins or if they don't. If they want to find mycotoxins, they're almost always going to take the sample from the moldiest part of the feed. Guess what? If the mold's growing, it's not being stressed in most of the instances to produce large quantities of mycotoxin. So what happens? They submit that sample, they come back, 0 mycotoxin. So usually we go back to the drawing board, well, there's no mycotoxins in there, right? This is an example from the 2013 crops, really problematic year for DON contamination. Again, this is an extreme example. We have 2 corn grain here that, although they have high concentrations of DON or alanone, they're not extremely high. We have this corn grain right here that's about 7 parts per million of DON. We have this one that looks like most of the corn we see every day, and it has 263 parts per million and 83 parts per million of alanone. 1 corn kernel could cause a whole lot of problem in a swine operation just from this batch, right? So again, we have to remove those biases from the system. We have to set up sampling procedures that can assess and can accurately get a representative samples in our feedstuff. And this is really important. The second component of this question is we do have a better understanding of the occurrence and the effects. We have protocols and we have programs that say, well, if we have a drought year, we increase the amount of sampling we do for aflatoxin assessment. If we have a late harvest, we have a less than ideal climate, colder weather in the winter, we increase our awareness of DON or alanone analysis, and we create programs that are based on that. But in general, we still know very little about why does that mold produce a toxin. Right? We know very little information about that. We think in many cases it's a response to a stress. Okay? We know this for a fact because in some cases when you kill the mold, let's say you put propionic acid on a moldy feedstuff, as that mold is dying, it actually can produce some of these toxins. So again, as it's dying, it's producing these compounds, and that could be extremely problematic. Obviously, it's better to kill the mold so it doesn't have to be affected by changes in temperature or humidity in that feedstuff, but even just killing that mold can actually be enough of a stressor for that mold to produce the toxin. We also know that they're a competitive advantage tool. Okay? So here we have multiple microorganisms in a micro substrate or a micro ecosystem, and if I can produce something that is toxic to my competitors, I can be the king of the mountain. I can compete better in that environment. We know that many of these mycotoxins have antimicrobial properties. There's obviously the most famous mycotoxin is penicillin, right? So it's very good antimicrobial, right? So they actually produce these compounds to be able to outcompete other microorganisms in that ideal substrate. The last one is actually pretty interesting. It's more particular to Fusarium graminearum, and it's actually a mechanism that the mold uses to be able to spread throughout that feedstuff or through that substrate. So here's the example. It's hard to explain on this, but I'm going to try to do it really fast. Basically, what they did is took 2 strains of Fusarium graminearum, one that produces DON, one that does not produce DON. So with the non-DON producing, they will inject it in one of the spigots and come back 2 to 3 days later, and that spigot is actually full of the mold, but just that one spigot. So they take the same experimental protocol, and they introduce Fusarium graminearum that does produce DON, and they come back 2 to 3 days later, and there's Fusarium graminearum in all of the other spigots. So what happens is that irritant that we all know DON is a very strong irritant. It produces that irritant, which creates microaberrations on the cover mechanism of that seed that allows it to penetrate and get into the other seeds. So it's a pretty unique and pretty neat mechanism to be able to propagate and to actually gain access to sometimes a difficult seed to internalize in. We do have increased incidence in some years. I mean, anybody that's followed mycotoxin work over the last 5 years can tell at least two very interesting studies, at least in the United States, that have occurred. We had a very high aflatoxin year, and we had a very high DON year, and just in the last 5 to 7 years. So these are the environmental stressors that I talked about that sometimes trigger the competitive advantage for that specific mycotoxin-producing mold, and can also trigger the mold to start producing some of these mycotoxins. This is can be sometimes controversial subject, especially around elections in the United States, but it shouldn't be really that controversial. We do have a very interesting trend of climate change, temperature increase. As a matter of fact, 2015 was the hottest year in history. 2016 surpassed that, so we've had the two highest temperature years in recorded history just the last 2 years. And the other phenomenon is the occurrence or the reoccurrence of phenomenons that are fairly intensive changing weather pattern phenomenons like El Nino and La Nina. We do see a much more reoccurrence of El Nino years. We used to have larger gaps between those phenomenons. It seems that we've shrunk down that considerably. And obviously, we have the reoccurrence of La Nina and some prolonged La Nina events like we've seen in the last two major El Nino years. We'll talk a little bit about that, although I'm not a meteorologist. One of the really interesting events we had was 2009, 2010 corn harvest. We had a very late harvest. Temperatures weren't ideal for growth, so the harvest was delayed. It also rained during the harvest time, so it was even further delayed. A lot of the material was harvested at a very high moisture content in the Midwest. No capabilities or very limited capabilities of drying that corn. So we had a very unusual, very high contamination of DON in corn materials. And that year, about 60% of the samples had 1 to 7 parts per million DON. Just to give you some perspective, swine operations would typically worry much more about DON, would make an effort to try to be under half a parts per million. So if you think about it, it was very difficult for them to actually buy material within what their accepted ranges are. Corn byproducts offer similar problems. Obviously, we tend to concentrate the mycotoxins in most of the corn byproducts. Look at DDGS samples. About 80% of the samples were within 8 and 25 parts per billion. This is not cost and effect. This is not the same corn that was made into DGS, but it just gives you an idea how problematic a year, just an eventful year like 2010 was to the contamination. I still see corn from 2009 being sold in some situations in the United States. It's been stored for many years, waiting for people, I guess, to forget about it, but it still pops up. When you see those values in the 20, 30 parts per million, you have to be very suspicious that they came from that far away. We also had a couple of eventful years as far as drought-related. These are usually mostly related with El Nino type of events. We had the intensifying of the temperature in 2011. Again, these are regions of the United States that typically have higher temperatures, but the drought was very significant. We looked at a map. Neogen produces these maps on some regular basis, and again, we see a higher concentration of the hotter weather associated mycotoxins like fumonisin and aflatoxin, and then a more generalized trichotesin response. This is what a typical map would look like on a year-to-year. Intensity would be lower or higher depending on what happened that year, but this is what the distribution usually looks like in the United States. 2012, El Nino year, one of the traditional patterns that you see is a shifting of temperature because of all this water current and the cold air and cold water temperatures moving. Basically, what you get is a shifting of the temperatures to the east or the north. So basically, we took all that drought environment and we moved it in the corn belt of the United States. An environment that's not very well adapted to drought, not much irrigation systems. And what we had aflatoxin concentrations in the major part of corn production in the United States. Again, not a usual phenomenon, but it did occur, and it did occur associated with an event like El Nino. Not going to spend too much time on El Nino. Again, this is not my subject matter, but we looked at 2015 and compared it to 1997, which was one of the largest El Nino in history. This was actually preparing to be an extremely intensive El Nino year. What happened? Some things happened, but it wasn't to the intensity of our expectation. Mostly probably related to these Arctic jet stream currents that were actually very high on the 2015 and may have actually prevented some of the events. Now, looking forward, what you want to focus on here is that each one of these peaks represents a Nino type year. Not all of them were actually classified as El Nino, but what you want to look at is what the blue lines actually, or the blue area represents, and it's typically La Nina event that typically follows El Nino event. And what we see is when we have major El Nino events, we have what we would call a prolonged La Nina event. So it would be either 1 to 3 years of La Nina type of environment. So those are the kind of things that we should be looking at in the future. Here's 2016, so we should expect something similar to what happened in 97 in the upcoming years. Again, can we prepare for that? I don't know. Am I on time? Am I even close? Or I just want to make sure. Oh, okay, it's actually working, so I'm good. The other side of this is related to agronomic practices. This is really peculiar because, again, we do a lot of things based on some basic understanding of what we should be doing to be better stewards of the environment, be better farmers, very things. We have to do things like recommending direct planting instead of tilling, but we don't always take into consideration what other negative impacts those practices do have. And there is some really interesting data that suggests that as we till, we actually take that soil-borne microorganisms and we expose them to the environment and we kill them. Okay, we break cycles, microbiological cycles, and this is some data out of Pennsylvania State University where we actually went in there and we mechanically damaged the kernels to improve the contamination, but we did see very significant differences between no-till and a heavy till in the environment. What typically happens is you get a contamination because there was an environmental condition that year, you go direct planting, and you don't break that cycle. So you have reoccurrence of those events year. Again, I'm not here to argue that we should till or we shouldn't till. That's not my subject matter. I'm just saying that when you go from one of those extremes, you do have to take into consideration some potential bad things that can happen in that environment. And in so many of these cases, we've actually been able to go into some of these environments and actually recommend a heavy tilling and have been seeing some interesting responses to it. There's another component here that I won't take too much on the genetic vulnerability. There's some data out there that looks at turkeys in the wild versus turkeys in commercial operations and have seen very significant difference in the amount of enzymes needed for aflatoxin detoxification. So as we bred these turkeys to be better animals, more higher producing animals, we've actually bred out a little bit of their potential capacity to detoxify aflatoxin. And that could be very problematic. Again, I'm not saying we should go back in our breeding protocols. We just need to understand that there is sometimes some negative impacts. The last one is, I think, for me, the most important, I think the most exciting one. We've taken our production animals and we fine-tune it. We've taken this vehicle and we've made it into a Formula One race car, but sometimes we put it in a country road, right? We don't always give it the best environment to thrive on. And that creates a lot of stresses into that model. And mycotoxins just fit into the overall stress model in there. So the more stressors in that model, the more potential issues we're going to have long term. I apologize for using pig data, but this is probably the most significant data that we can use to explain this point. If we look at 1916 to 2000 and litters per sow per year, we went from 1.27 to 2.2. It's pretty impressive improvement. If you look at pig rears per sow per year, 13 to 22. Feed conversion rate from 4 to 2.5. Overall herd efficiency from 6 to 3.8, half of that. We've done great things to create a much more efficient animal, much more higher producing animal. But in that same token, we're actually increasing stress into that model. And if we don't take all those additional concepts in there, we're going to have problems. Basically, what I'm trying to say is if I feed 100 parts per billion of mycotoxin Y to this animal, I'm going to get a different response than if I feed it to this animal. Okay? They're under different performance environmental conditions, and they may potentially respond different to those issues. The dairy cow is actually very peculiar. We have a lot of things going on while the cow is producing. I'm not going to spend way too much time on this, but I think there's 3 critical periods that I think are extremely important in dairy cattle production according to their sensitivity to a potential mycotoxicosis. Early lactation, we've all talked about negative energy balance. This is a really critical period because the liver is very important in metabolizing that body tissue into energy. If we look at most of the mycotoxins that we're concerned with, almost all of them are hepatotoxic. So again, if we take a bad liver, we take a guy that likes to drink a lot, and we give him a ton of pistachios with a lot of aflatoxin, we're not creating a really great drinking environment for that person. Same thing happens to cows. We got to make sure that that liver health is protected, and introducing mycotoxins into that system is not a great idea. The other part that's really important is the recovery period, the late lactation dry period. Those animals need to recover their body condition. If we introduce mycotoxins that will affect intestinal integrity, increases the maintenance energy, we have less capability to actually recover that body weight. The cow doesn't get to the proper body condition. Next lactation, she doesn't perform like she should be. The other side of this equation is transition period. Everybody talks about that. But again, we looked at this 2 weeks prior, 2 weeks after, so natural immunosuppression as the animal prepares for that calving event. If we introduce a compound that is potentially immunosuppressive in that period, we're going to cause more problems. So those are, for me, the critical periods for production. I'm finished, so we don't have to worry too much. I would like to mention that we don't focus a lot of attention on the penicillin-produced mycotoxins. We've done some preliminary data looking at silages and other forages, and penicillin molds are the most commonly found in those materials. There's a lot of mycotoxins as the molds produced. We have very little knowledge on what they could potentially do, but I am particularly concerned on what their potential damage could be to ruminal mycoflora, ruminal populations, because again, a lot of those compounds are actually antibiotic, have antibiotic properties, and they could potentially be altering ruminal populations. So I'll leave you with this last slide just to note that mycotoxin is contamination, the events associated. It's a pretty complex biological equation. You know, we have susceptibility in the field, the environment affects us, our actual own actions affect that, how we store the materials. We're trying to reduce exposure to the human populations either through direct consumption of those materials or through carryover of products that can be contaminated in the animals. Obviously, for a lot of us in this room, we're also concerned about the impact that those toxins can have on animal production. And with that, I would like to thank you guys again, and hopefully we may have 2 seconds for a question or something like that.
Thank you, Professor Diaz. I know you wanted about 45 minutes, so that was very well done. Thanks for being on time. We do have a couple of minutes for a question or two. I guess I'm going to avoid the pistachio nuts with my beer tonight.
Yeah, maybe with your hard alcohol. Beers might be okay.
Sorry, Donald, speak up.
Thanks for sharing interesting information. Could you go back to the slide with some pictures of kernels?
Uh-huh.
The contamination level. Yeah, this one.
Mm-hmm.
On the right, it's really brown, even darker.
Mm-hmm.
Why so this contamination level on the less than the left one?
So again, there's several things that occur here. Okay, when you look at the kernel right now, you're making the association that whatever's growing on that corn kernel right now is producing mycotoxin. But that mycotoxin contamination could have occurred in the field and could have not even represented into contamination here. So you look at this corn kernel, it's actually internal contamination that occurred much prior to the storage of this material. So when this material gets stored, all sorts of things grow on it. You know, these things are growing in there, and they have very little impact on the potential of population. What happened in a situation like this is that the molds or yeast that are growing in here outcompeted the ones that were actually producing the mycotoxin, and that's why it looks that way. But again, there is very little correlation between presence of mold and actual presence of mycotoxin, because in many of the cases, as the mold is actually dying, it actually produces these toxins, or they don't always co-occur at the same time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Because a lot of customers in China, they say, wow, you see, they use the eyes, they say, oh, wow, this looks nicer, you know. There's no problem with mycotoxin contamination. Just, microscopy. But when we show this picture to our customers, they look, it looks nicer, but actually it's much higher contamination than
There are some mycotoxins that can be correlated with grading. So for many mycotoxins, for aflatoxin primarily, the toxin itself, the mold itself, doesn't have the ability to penetrate into the kernel. So it typically requires some damage to that kernel, whether that be an environmental damage, insect damage, or heat damage. So when you look at aflatoxin, there is a good correlation with grading. Yeah, as the grading gets worse, typically the more aflatoxin you find. But with a lot of the trichotes and fusarium-based mycotoxins, because they're actually generating their own mechanism to penetrate into the kernel, that correlation does not exist. So in general, you want to buy higher grade corn, right? It makes perfect sense. And if it's cheap and it looks like that, well, I mean, if it looks like that, you shouldn't buy it anyways. But I'm saying, you know, a lot of times we make decisions based on a visual indicator.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
One point. Did you do aflatoxin analysis?
Well, they did. This was done by Trilogy Lab. They did several mycotoxins, but because this was from 2009, 2010 harvest. We had a lot of problems with DONs around them. So that was the focus here, was to actually get an assessment of what the kernels were looking like and why we should not really focus on visual estimator. I doubt that there was much aflatoxin. I looked at the numbers that year. We just didn't have that much. This is Midwestern corn too, so in general, we don't have that many problems.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.